Coogs House. It's time for football season again. Is that weird? We're back in football season, at least for a couple days.
You are Locked On Cougs, your daily podcast on the Houston Cougars, part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.
Welcome to Locked On Cougs, daily podcast about your Houston Cougars. I'm your host, Houston-born teacher and coach, Parker Ainsworth, here to break down all things Cougs. If you're a U of H fan or just a hater can stop by, please be sure to subscribe down below. That way you can get the podcast in your feed each day. We appreciate you making Locked On Cougs your first listen of the day. And welcome to the YouTube channel. It's good to see you again. A reminder, when we get to 250 subscribers, we are giving away a Marcus Sasser shirt. So make sure you hit subscribe to be entered into that. We have to get to 250 subscribers. Make sure you hit subscribe. And then be commenting down below if after watching us preview the bowl game today, you have nothing else to say. Make sure you tell us what kind of, do you put jelly, jam, or preserves on your PB&J. Andy Yanez, I was going to say of Gallery Sports, but of a number of different things. Really, Andy, how are you doing today?
I'm doing good, Parker. How are you?
I'm good. Andy, if you watch the Cougars, you probably know Andy is. But Andy covers, again, Houston Cougars for men's basketball, football, and women's basketball. Gallery Sports. Let's Rage Cougs is the post-game show after every men's basketball game this season. Right, Andy?
And football.
And football. I guess it's been a minute.
Like you said, yeah, it's kind of been a restart after. Honestly, it might be just trauma-induced from Houston football fans. The way the season ended, kind of wanted to push that out of the way. But yeah, it's kind of a soft reset for one more game, and then the next time we're doing this, it'll be in preparation of the first Big 12 season, way back in a few more months.
Let's talk about that trauma field, because I do want to start with Houston loses to Tulsa in a game they shouldn't have lost. And I don't mean that to say Houston played poorly and still played a close game. I think that we can safely say that. This is not to digest that game too much, but there hasn't been a whole lot of conversation out of the program. There's the occasional presser, but not very frequent. The occasional news about who's looking at what. A couple guys announced they're going to the league after the bowl game. So, Andy, as a guy covering this team very, very closely, what have you been hearing about the Houston Cougar football team in the last month?
No, you're absolutely right when it comes to maybe not radio silence, but pretty dang close to it in regards to availabilities. I think right now, like you said, after the way the season ended against Tulsa in a game that was kind of a tale of two halves, in particular when it came to the offense and how they struggled in that second half against Tulsa. Since then, it's kind of been really on the down low. Now, Dana Holgorsen spoke with reporters about 2 weeks ago, and he kind of gave an update, one looking ahead at Louisiana, but in particular, what everyone wants to look for, it's kind of how the roster makeup is going to change, in particular when it comes to the transfers and just continuing to add recruits, both out of the high school route, like I did mention, from that portal that's changed college football. I think the biggest, at least the eye-grabbing name that's come to my attention so far, and I believe it was Mark Berman from Fox 26, the local Fox station here in Houston that reported it first, is the interest that both Houston has in quarterback, I guess he's entered the portal now, but Texas Tech quarterback Donovan Smith, who was at the Houston Cougars men's basketball game when they played Alabama now 10 days ago. That happened, and really for the football team, that was kind of like the premier event that they had for all the football recruits to kind of, obviously when they're recruiting at the end of the day, they're trying to sell them to the University of Houston, and I think that's the perfect game to do it. And if I was the coaching staff, I'm sure the pitching was, the sales pitch was, hey, look at this, look at how crazy the atmosphere is here, be a part of into the first year in the Big 12. This is what we're trying to build. This is what the university looks like when you're hitting on all cylinders, when you've proven that like the Cougars men's basketball team has with the track record, how nationally relevant they are, that the university is going to embrace you. They're going to rally behind you. This is what you could be a part of, which is the perfect game to do it. Now, Alabama came here and they kind of ruined that for the Cougars in that aspect. But, outside of that, it has been relatively quiet just over. I know they've been a few commitments that the University of Houston Cougars have had over the past few weeks. Now, one of the things that Dana Holgorsen has said is that he was really happy with the where this bowl game was scheduled in terms of the time of the year. It's not early December, which Dana Holgorsen said at times if you have like an early bowl game that we just had like a week ago, it kind of cuts into their ability to be able to recruit, and it kind of takes time away. So he was kind of happy where it's not like towards the end of the year where it's New Year's, but it is very pivotal for them because it kind of buys them that extra week. Because it was interesting after that Tulsa game. Obviously, the week after that is the American Athletic Conference Championship game, which Houston was not going to be playing in for the way that season ended. We'll get more into that later. But that week between Tulsa and the conference championship game, even though Houston wasn't playing, it was a dead period for Houston. They couldn't go out and recruit. Obviously, they're not going to practice for a game 3 weeks out in advance. So that's something where, because the bowl game was kind of a little bit toward the end of December, it allowed the coaching staff some flexibility and be able to recruit while they're also preparing for this bowl game against Louisiana.
Yeah, and it's interesting that I'm glad you laid out in fairly, I think, easy to understand terms. Like the coaching staff was working even though we didn't see them, right? Like things have been happening even though it's not on national television the same kind of way. You mentioned Donovan Smith. I think folks remember he was the quarterback to Texas Tech. Texas Tech Houston was a fun game to kind of start the year back when we had much higher hopes about how the season was going to go, right? He did throw a couple touchdowns, 350 yards. Houston was able to pick him off a couple times. So as a young quarterback there, I think I have him down as a redshirt sophomore, if I'm reading this correctly. So he would have a couple years eligibility if he were to come. Donovan Smith does, that is. Houston is looking to get quarterbacks in the transfer portal, and obviously we'll break down as soon as one signs. But in heading into this bowl game, it's interesting that, the coaching staff, as you're pointing out, is looking at like things for next season. Like how are you anticipating them using the bowl game to get ready for next season? Is that happening at all?
Oh, absolutely. Especially, I think the two key pivotal parts. And again, it's kind of that weird phase because I think when you look at the meat and potatoes of the offense, the two key players for the Cougars this past season, it all started with quarterback Clayton Tune and obviously their top receiver in Tank Dell. Well, both of those guys, they're not going to be here next season. Obviously, Clayton Tune, when it comes to his time, is just up. He's a senior. He's on to moving on to his future endeavors. When it comes to Tank Dell, it was a bit interesting because he was technically a junior, so he could have come back if he wanted to for a senior season, but obviously we're a week or two. I've lost track a lot of these days. It all kind of becomes one, but just I believe a few days ago, long story short, Tank Dell said that he was going to be declaring himself for the NFL draft. He's going to try to get his way into the professional leagues. He's not going to be returning to Houston next season. And I think it was interesting because, one, obviously he made that announcement, but he said he was going to play in the bowl game, which I found that interesting. And the reason he gave for that, and this is something that Dana Holgorsen himself has said, there's kind of a feeling among the team where, again, the disappointment just overall to the 2022 season with all the high expectations and then the way it ended on their senior night, losing to a Tulsa team that, hey, they turned around and they fired their head coach that same week, even though they beat the Cougars. It just kind of left a bad taste overall in the mouth of the program overall. And it's something that they've kind of, the term that's been used is they feel like they owe the fans a win to kind of get off on a positive note. And in particular, when it comes to Tank, he said just, again, being able to play one more game with Clayton Tune, have that dynamic duo that's really been the identity for the offense this past season. It's a cool opportunity for them to try to go out on the right note. And in regards to Tank specifically, he was asked, what kind of what were the factors into declaring for the NFL draft? And one of them, he said, is that quarterback position, because after Clayton Tune, after this game, the quarterback position is going to look very, very different for the Cougars. As of now, looking ahead to 2023, the only quarterback on the roster is Lucas Coley, who obviously the transfer from Arkansas a season ago. He got very, very limited minutes this past season and never really had the opportunity to showcase anything flashes. Like the most he ever got was a couple throws in a game here and there. And then, I mean, we got to see a lot of the times him being able to hand it off. That's something we were able to see. But one quarterback on the roster, that's not going to cut it. So something Dana Holgorsen said in this 2 weeks ago, again, I believe, is when he said, in the transfer portal, they're looking for a quarterback. You mentioned Donovan Smith, who's kind of the big attention grabber just because of Houston's familiar with, again, like he was able to hurt the Cougars in that overtime game way back when. But just, he said, in a perfect world, obviously they're looking for a quarterback in the transfer portal. In a perfect world, they be able to land 2 quarterbacks in the transfer portal because it's just Lucas Coley. And I asked, Holgorsen what kind of he looks for in a quarterback. And he said experience, number one, that's kind of priority for quarterbacks in the transfer portal, is what Holgorsen said. They look at how he is from a student and leadership standpoint. Obviously, the quarterback position, you not only have to be able to lead the offense, but really you're kind of the face of the entire program, especially a starting quarterback. So that's very important for them. And then the last point there is the most obvious, but talent level, of course. So those are the 3 really kind of bullet points that the coaching staff looks for in a transfer quarterback. And I'm pretty sure it's just quarterback in general, regardless when they're looking to bring them into the program. So that's going to be something that certainly is going to be a lot of eyes, because potentially it could be a competition to bring in with Lucas Coley and who's going to be that next face for the Houston Cougars next season when they're in their first year in the Big 12, which there's going to be a lot of eyeballs, a lot of buzz and excitement just from that standpoint. So that position is going to be really important.
It's going to be really important, and frankly, it's going to be odd for, Clayton Tune was not the most charismatic, over the top guy. I'm not saying he was just more an introverted person than that. But it's going to be weird having a different guy take snaps, right? It felt like he's been here for a long. I mean, obviously he's a 5th-year senior. He's been here for a long, long time, and it'll just be. It's odd to be going into this big Big 12 shift without any veteran taking snaps. I would, if I were a gambler, I'd say I'd bet on Houston finding someone in the portal. I'm hoping it's Donovan Smith, but that comes in and starts in front of Coley. I know Coley just transferred in a year ago. If you're a gambling person, betonline.net is your #1 source for sports betting info, stats, news, and analysis. You can get the latest odds on all professional and amateur leagues out there, pro football, college basketball, college bowl season, World Cup. I guess that's in the past tense now, but they've got it all covered at betonline.net. If you love sports podcasts, you can find those at BetOnline as well. They're always the fastest and easiest way to get your sports betting info. Head to the site today or use mobile device to learn more. BetOnline is where the game starts. Andy, I've been saying that on betonline.net, they've got the Cougars as 6.5-point favorites. I'm taking the Cougs and the points there. I think they win by more than a touchdown. You got any advice for bettors out there?
My advice is do not bet on the Houston Cougars because they have been so unpredictable this season. I mean, my goodness, you don't know where you're going to get. And I kind of say that in jest, by the way. You mentioned the World Cup in that ad read, by the way. What a crazy World Cup finale that was. But that's a story for another day. Yeah, when it comes to the Houston Cougars, the football team specifically, there's not, and that's kind of been the story of the year for the 2022 Cougars. Inconsistency has been their consistency. That's been the one thing you can rely on. You have no idea what you're going to get. I think much more from the offense. They've been that one constant, and again, that's kind of the big storyline from an overall perspective. Just Clayton Tune and Tank Dell is going to be like their last hoorah, for the lack of a better phrase, just in terms of those two, but. The defense, that's the biggest question mark, because it's been so up and down, and for the most part it's been bad. Going back to the SMU game when they got all the jokes in hey, SMU and Houston, was that a basketball game? No, SMU, the football team, put up 77 points on the Houston Cougars defense, and then a few weeks later they follow it up by almost shutting out East Carolina. I mean, they only held them to a field goal. That's the most impressive showing they've had all season long. And then again, they turn around to Tulsa, and they can't stop them in the second half. And Tulsa was able to execute and make just enough plays to be able to walk off with a win. And that was a very impressive showing. Going back to the East Carolina game, that was a team that had been clicking on all cylinders, especially on offense, with kind of similar to Clayton Tune. They had a quarterback that was setting records just for, again, where he was at a standpoint as a senior in the American Athletic Conference, and they completely shut them down. Now they turn around to a struggling Tulsa team, and they struggle to hold them down. Even going back to Temple, when they had their quarterback, I know he's related to Kurt Warner, but still, they just – that's why there's not really much confidence in what you'll expect. They could go out there, and Louisiana, obviously they come into this bowl game 6-6, and really, I know we were talking off air about what common opponent is, what can you kind of take away from that aspect. They only had one common opponent, which was Rice, and I guess Houston has an advantage because they were able to beat Rice and Louisiana wasn't. But I don't know. You really just don't. I think it's much more on the defense, because you don't know what to expect from that aspect. Will it be a strong defense now that they've had close to a month to kind of reevaluate, assess. There's going to be a lot of players, especially if they're not returning, that are playing for next season, kind of proving, hey, there's something there. Don't give up on me or whatever you're looking for in transporter when you recruits. I'm here to stay. I can make an impact for you guys in the first season of the Big 12. So you don't know who's going to go out there and make plays, but just overall from the season, there hasn't been anything that instills confidence from that defensive standpoint. And again, going back to the Tulsa game, the offense has shown that they can get shut down. Now, I think it's much more of an anomaly. So if you, I guess, betting advice, take the over, whatever the over under is. But that's pretty much it.
Well, and so in focusing on Louisiana, their offense is somewhere between Eastern Carolina and SMU. I would have thought Eastern Carolina had better offense going into that game, though, and so I guess that's probably
statistically they did, and the Cougars shut them down. And give credit to the Cougars because they dominated East Carolina in that game. Again, with the veteran quarterback that they had, and they look like the defense from a year ago. Or I guess here's the tricky part: the 2021 Houston Cougars defense that carried really the Cougars throughout that 12-2 record. Just
had pro corners, yeah,
exactly. That's what we expected, and really much more from the defensive line standpoint. They created that identity of Sac Ave, all that identity for that defense. It hasn't been the case in 2022, but in that game against East Carolina, they showed that flash that everyone thought they could be, but then they turned around, and again, that inconsistency has been their story all season long.
So the Louisiana quarterback, I think the guy who's taken the most snaps has been Woolridge, and looking at him as a guy that could present problems, he's not a tremendous runner. And I think that kind of, in my head, initially makes me think that Sac Ave and the defensive front will have a good game, easy time getting after him. He'll be fairly stationary. But again, I wouldn't have called Mordecai at SMU a great runner. He was spunky, right? I don't know if I'd gone much farther than that. And we saw them put up 77 points. If I'm looking at the Louisiana game, you mentioned the common opponent, Rice. Louisiana lost to Rice by 12. Houston beat Rice in an ugly 7-point win, right? I'm not sure how much of the transitive property works there, but I do think that Houston ought to be favored in this game, not just because BetOnline.net has them favored, but because I think they're the better team. And frankly, they have, if you look at composite rankings on recruiting classes the past 5 years, if you look at they've got better players, but Houston doesn't seem to always perform like they have better players. As you look at this game and preparing for Louisiana on Friday, is there anybody that you're keeping an eye oh crap, we're really screwed in that area, or anything like that? Or is it just kind of it's more about what Houston's doing?
I think it's much more about what Houston's doing, and I think it's like you bring up about that SMU game where Tanner Mordecai wasn't necessarily the most mobile quarterback, but something that the Houston defense struggled in a lot, especially throughout the entire season, was being able to come up and make tackles to limit. Because when you look at the Cougars defense overall in the season, they weren't necessarily getting torched by big plays. It's just quarterbacks tossing it all over the place and getting chunk plays that way. A lot of the times, some of them, it'd be that the receiver was just wide open, but a lot of times it'd be they toss it short and the Cougars just weren't able to come up and make the tackles. And that's something that Doug Belk talked about throughout the entire season. It was a focus. It was one of the key areas that they wanted to improve on throughout the season, and they struggled in. So you mentioned Louisiana overall as a whole. If Houston is struggling to make tackles, they're going to be able to make plays. And I will say this, just overall, during the tenure of Dana Holgorsen as the head coach, the Cougars have relatively performed well in games that they're favored and they're supposed to win. It's kind of been those even matchups or those underdog matchups where Houston struggled. And so I guess if you look in that aspect, you could pull some confidence from that. But I think it's much more on the Houston Cougars defense because, like you said, on paper, the Cougars should be favored in every aspect. They should be the favorites in every single category when it comes to recruits, when it comes to stats, the playmakers. There's no one in Louisiana that's at the level of Clayton Tune and Tank Dell just on the offensive standpoint right there. So Houston overall, on paper at least, should have the better team. Now, obviously, you look at just once you get on the field, it's about executing. And that's been kind of one of the issues in the games that the Cougars have lost. It's kind of been really a lot of times it's been them shooting themselves in the foot. I mean, go back to the Texas Tech game, 4th and 20. They get that stop on 4th and 20, and they come out of Lubbock with that win. I mean, for all you know, it's a completely different season because then you're entering that Kansas game undefeated. It's 2-0 against 2-0 against, obviously, at that point, a red-hot Kansas team. You have much more confidence going into that game. And maybe, you know, it's a different season. So that's kind of been the story all year, the Tulane game. First play or first drive in overtime, I believe they settled for a field goal, if I'm not mistaken. And then Tulane drives down the field and they win it with a walk-off touchdown. That's basically been the story of this defense. They haven't been able to get the stops when needed. And if they can buckle down and get that against Louisiana, I don't think there's much more that the Ragin Cajuns can do from a on the field standpoint, because Houston is, at least again, I'll caveat this by saying on paper they should be the better team and they should go out there and win that common opponent by rice. Even though it was an ugly game for Houston, they were able to come out victorious while Louisiana wasn't. So when you look at that aspect, I think what that translates to about the Cougars should win by 2 touchdowns if you do the math correct. But no, I think it's much more on Houston and can they execute. I think that's the big storyline heading into this game, and in a crazy environment that out of all the games from Louisiana you wouldn't expect this to be, but weather is going to be a factor. It's going to be freezing, and I'm not just using that as like a hyperbole. It's literally going to be freezing in that game. It'll be below 32, so that's something that both teams are probably not used to playing in that type of environment. So that could be an outside factor too that we didn't think about it when that game was first announced, and now it's going to be something too. If they, you know, who can execute well in that cold environment.
Yeah, and I think what's interesting in looking at this and focusing on Houston is it's set up to be kind of the ultimate. You talk about the defense in Sac Avenue. The Sac Avenue pass rush and pressure was not turning into defensive stops all season, right? D'Anthony Jones going to have to quarterback is great, but when he can like hit the check down and then no one tackles the check down, it turns into a 10-yard gain. It doesn't do anything, right? As far as Lafayette's pass blocking grades go on Pro Football Focus, they're low. to be blunt, they're consistently out of place, including against Florida State's not a common opponent, but it's a bigger school. And if Houston wants to move in the Big 12, I think that'd be like that's like where you're idealizing yourself being.
Absolutely, yeah.
That's they were only in the right place pass blocking 40% of the time against that common opponent of Rice. They're only in the right place 55.5% of the time, right? Those aren't great numbers, and that's the kind of thing that Sac Avenue can do so well in. My worry is that, okay, they're going to hit the checkdowns. Will Art Green, are we going to rally up and make the tackles in those instances after the fact? They don't have explosive athletes like, I know it's hard to think about, like Texas Tech and Kansas at the start of the season were very good. Like they don't quite have those kinds of athletes. They don't have a Rasheed Rice like SMU had. They don't bluntly have the same kind of pro caliber guys that Houston has. And so I feel like Houston ought to win, but that has me worried. You mentioned the weather, and I want to bring up like our guys wearing head covers and long sleeves when we went and played Navy. Like that was like kind of chilly. This is going to be real time cold. There's chances of sleet, snow throughout the weekend. You mentioned it's going to be below 32 at kickoff of, like how does that impact the Houston Cougar offense, defense, special teams?
Yeah, you mentioned it. It's funny that Navy game how they had to prepare. That probably might have been the coldest game of the season that they faced. I'm not sure how cold it was when they played SMU up in Dallas at the beginning of November. So I'm not entirely too sure, but that's going to be the story of it, especially when it's frigid. I'm thinking of that just because the Packers played last night. We're recording this on a Tuesday, so Monday Night Football, how cold it was in Lambeau. The biggest thing that gets said, the football is going to feel like you were catching a dang rock because of how cold it'll be. I'll be curious because that's something that from a receiver standpoint, they played them a little bit with drops. Especially from some of the younger receivers. Even in that game against Tulsa, Tank Dell had a couple of uncharacteristic drops. in that game. So if Houston, and it's something that Dana Holgorsen has mentioned, well, they would like to be able to establish the run game. I know towards the tail end of the season, they kind of relied much more on Clayton Tune to generate a lot of the offense. But really, when they were at their best was when they were able to get on their running game going. And at times it was Brandon Campbell, at times it was Stacey Sneed, Tajon Henry in the mix as well. I think that'll be a key factor too if they can get the ground game going. And I think at the end of the day, if Houston can just take care of the ball, and like you mentioned, if Sackhoff can get to the quarterback, if they can make those tackles, don't make mistakes, force Louisiana into a couple turnovers, that's the recipe for success in that environment. Because for as much as Houston's not prepared to be in that element, in that environment, Louisiana isn't either. So it could very well be who adapts faster, and it'll just be interesting to see who is able to kind of not let the weather affect them in that aspect, because it'll probably be subtle things like that, but at the end of the day, who adjusts faster.
All right, so that's going to do it for us today. We're about halfway through the preview. You can check us out for the second part tomorrow here at Locked On Cougs. I want to say thank you so much to Andy stop by. He'll also be with us for the second half tomorrow, but thank you so much. You can check him out at Yanez_5 on Twitter. He's also obviously doing all kinds of written work with Gallery Sports and all kinds of audio stuff on YouTube and things like that with Pod Slam and Jam after each and every Houston Cougar men's basketball or football game. So make sure you check him out, give him a follow, keep in touch, and keep up to date with all the latest on the Cougs. With them and us, if you're a Cougs fan, we're all over the place. Make sure you find him there. Thank you so much for listening to Locked On Cougs today. Again, we're halfway through previewing this bowl game. We'll be back for the second half tomorrow. Locked On Cougs, a primary Locked On podcast network. If you're looking for a second listen, let me recommend Locked On Astros. A bunch of big time signings over the weekend and kind of a doldrum. Let's go celebrate the World Series, right? Like we're talking about kind of a up and down football season, kind of a down NBA season. Let's go celebrate the World Series. Make sure you check out Locked On Astros for that as well. Thank you so much for tuning in today. And Locked On Cougs, the primary Locked On podcast network. Your team every day. Go Cougs.